In his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Daniel Goldhagen presented a German-specific form of what he called eliminationist antisemitism as a primary cause of the Holocaust. There were a number of sharp critiques of this analysis, and there were alternative, more intentionalist explanations, such as that offered by Christopher Browning in his book Ordinary Men, which focused more on individual psychology. Responses to Goldhagen changed the way in which anti-Semitism was analysed in Holocaust studies. More scholars began to focus on multicausal factors that occurred at the microhistorical level. These new microhistories offer a potentially rich source of previously undiscovered motivations and behaviour of individual perpetrators, which includes anti-Semitic beliefs and attitudes. While not necessarily the original intent of these studies, there is an important amount of data included in these microhistories. How might we be able to mine this data to uncover the impact of individual anti-Semitic attitudes in some of the most intense zones of killing? How can we use newer geographical and microhistorical approaches to the study of the Holocaust, along with newer methods for analysing anti-Semitism, to build models to help uncover this information? What do these newly discovered accounts add to our understanding? Tami Peterson is a current PhD candidate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College in the United States. She holds a Master of Research degree in Social and Political Theory and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Politics, Philosophy and History from Birkbeck, University of London.
I'm not your usual host. David Hirsch has asked me to do this on the basis that I'm particularly interested in this particular issue, which is perfectly true. I am. So this session, where we're welcoming Tami Peterson, about whom I'll say something in a minute, is part of the London Centre for the Study of Anti-Semitism's collaborative seminar series. And you can see a list of the events that have taken place already and the events that are coming up on the website. So I'm particularly keen for you to do that, but thank you for attending tonight virtually. And thank you, Tami, for coming to speak to us. So just a few words about Tami before I invite her to speak. Tami Peterson is a PhD candidate at Gratz College in New York and is speaking to us tonight from Brooklyn, New York, across the pond. She has already got a Master's in Research and Political Theory from Birkbeck College in this country, and is currently conducting research on perpetrator anti-Semitism in the Holocaust, which is the subject of tonight's talk. She will be speaking for about half an hour, and then I'll take questions, and we'll have some, no doubt, very interesting discussion about what is a very important and still unresearched issue, particularly at the local level. So Tami, over to you.
Thank you, Philip. Just going to go ahead and start my screen sharing here. I've got a PowerPoint for this presentation, so let me just do that. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Okay, great. So thank you for having me as part of this important seminar series. First, I'm going to look at the development of microhistories and Holocaust historiography before turning to an analysis of how these microhistories may help us to further understand anti-Semitism during the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, and the ways in which it might be measured using new analytical tools. Additionally, I will consider how the ability to analyze the anti-Semitic attitudes of individual perpetrators can help the field of the Holocaust studies to reintegrate the study of perpetrator anti-Semitism, despite a distancing in the field, partially as a result of the intentionalist functionalist debate surrounding Daniel Goldhagen's work, Hitler's Willing Executioners. The study of local collaboration and participation in the atrocities of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, the site of the highest levels of the killings of Jews, has gained traction in recent years in Holocaust historiography, particularly as part of what is known as the spatial turn. The intention of scholars that put forth the spatial analysis of the Holocaust was to provide a useful additional context for understanding the events, which had thus far relied mostly on ideological and state political perspectives. Through an analysis of genocidal killing in particular spaces, locations, and geographic areas, they attempted to answer the question of why. More specifically, the question of why did it happen in these places? Examples of recent works that attempt to do so are Geographies of the Holocaust, Hitler's Geographies, Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, Jan Gross's Neighbors, Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, and Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners. A number of important works on local collaboration and participation in atrocities brought to light previously unknown instances of direct complicity in murder and terror by non-German populations as well. Many of these works on local participation make up the new microhistories that we shall consider shortly. First, I want to discuss briefly the importance of the introduction of what is called thick description into Holocaust historiography, because it is a vital part of the newer microhistories that we will be discussing. Early Holocaust historians, most notably Raoul Hilberg, considered the perpetrator as an administrative functionary, and therefore, as Michael Wilt in his overview of Holocaust historiography notes, it was not testimonies or photos that represented the nucleus of the archive that Hilberg was looking for, but official documents. In his two-part analysis, Sal Friedlander led the way with incorporating Holocaust witness testimony into Holocaust history. His work, Years of Extermination, was groundbreaking and changed the way that the Holocaust was written about. Adding in testimony not only helped to bring in a more complete, thick description of what had taken place, but also humanized the victims, reclaiming them from mere numbers on Nazi documents and giving them back their full humanity. Consider this quote he includes from diary fragments of a young anonymous girl who watches helplessly as her friend and her friend's disabled father are deported from the Łódź ghetto, unaware that their fate was Chełmno. Where will she go with her sick, helpless father, without a shirt for him and with nothing for herself? Hungry, exhausted, without money and food. My mom immediately found some shirts for her and her father. My sister and I ran upstairs. When I came back, I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stay there longer because I had to finish the laundry. I promised to visit her. In this, we can see the power and importance of thick description over official documents. Microhistories combine the geographical aspects of the spatial turn with thick description, and this has helped to create the rich information that we can now utilize in the study of individual perpetrator antisemitism during the Holocaust, as we will discuss shortly. The focus in microhistories is on individual massacres and pogroms, as well as individual perpetrators, victims, neighborhoods, towns, and ghettos. Some examples of microhistories are most famously Neighbors by Jan Gross, about the Jedwabne massacre, as well as Wendy Lauer's recent work, The Ravine, based on a single photograph taken during a massacre in Mariupol, Ukraine, in October of 1941. Tim Cole's Holocaust City looks at the development of the ghettos in Budapest, Hungary, street by street, building by building. Most microhistories are seeking to answer both the question of why did it happen in these places, and also why these people. One of the subgenres of microhistory that is particularly popular is that which looks at perpetrator psychology. This subgenre largely focuses on perpetrators in groups, as part of military organizations or police battalions, and has made up the majority of the texts in recent Holocaust historiography that look at perpetrators. These include Marching into Darkness by Waitman Wade Bjorn, that looks at the atrocities carried out by the Wehrmacht in Belarus, Analysis of German Police Battalions in Eastern Europe by Edward Westerman, and other books which utilize the Holocaust in an attempt to discover psychological explanations for mass murder. The proliferation of this subgenre is largely as a result of a debate in Holocaust historiography, to which we will now turn. The seminal work of this type of microhistory was Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, published in 1992, which looked at the actions of Police Battalion 101 in Eastern Europe. Browning attempts to explain why this group of reserves and older Germans, not fanatical young Nazis, were on the front lines of some of the most brutal killing on the Eastern Front. He claims that it was a variety of factors, including obedience to authority, which he seeks to explain by using the work of Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo. Though not all psychological, he concludes that these made up a majority of the multicausal factors and motivations that led them to becoming brutal killers. Without realizing it until their books were released, both Browning and Goldhagen were looking at and analyzing the very same police battalion. However, Goldhagen's conclusions were very different from Browning's. In his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Goldhagen argues that a key element of why people supported Hitler and the genocide of the Jews was a particular form of German anti-Semitism known as eliminationist anti-Semitism. This was, Goldhagen argued, inherent in German society because of Germany's unique history, and it was lying latent, merely needing to be activated by someone like Hitler. Goldhagen specifically argues that German eliminationist anti-Semitism is, quote, the monocausal motivation for the Holocaust. He argues that there can be no other explanation for the extreme cruelty, brutality of the ordinary men, like those of Police Battalion 101, the camps, and the death marches, unless there was an inherent hatred for Jews by German society at the heart of it. While Goldhagen does explore other factors, the emphasis on a special form of German anti-Semitism underpinning Nazi genocide was quickly seized upon by academics with a long history of studying the Holocaust. In addition to being considered a far too simplistic explanation, those scholars studying local collaboration with Nazi Germany in Eastern Europe were quick to point out that anti-Semitism in areas of mass killing, such as Ukraine, was not due to a German form of anti-Semitism at all, but a very local one. This led in turn to another type of microhistory that sought to look at local non-German atrocities, and a type of answer to Goldhagen's German-specific argument. Quick word on the intentionalist functionalist debate within which the Browning-Goldhagen debate is often placed. This debate within Holocaust methodology is roughly made up of two differing camps. The intentionalists argue that Hitler and the Nazis had a plan from the very beginning and intentionally implemented that plan from 1933 on, particularly with regard to the final solution. The functionalist perspective, on the contrary, sees the road to the final solution as one that was a function of a variety of factors, including the brutality of the war in the East, the fog of war, local bureaucracy, and more. The functionalists highlight that originally the Nazis called for the elimination of Jews from Europe, which included plans for mass expulsion in the beginning, but not mass extermination. And that the final solution only came about as the war progressed and became more violent, particularly in the East. The intentionalists claimed that Hitler's genocidal intent was clear from the beginning, and that he was only held back by strategic considerations. As such, Goldhagen is seen as being in the intentionalist camp, and Browning is seen as being in the functionalist camp. The work of most Holocaust scholars do not fit neatly into either category, but much of the work done today leans largely towards the functionalist, multicausal explanation instead of the top-down view of an intentional plan for extermination led by Hitler himself. It was important that academics of the Holocaust took on Goldhagen's erroneous and highly determinist thesis on eliminationist anti-Semitism as an explanation of a monocausal motivation for the Holocaust. This was even more important due to the acclaim that Goldhagen's work received outside of academia. However, this resulted in a turn away from analyzing anti-Semitism itself as a causal factor inside academia and Holocaust studies, and towards other explanations when it came to local violence. Because of this oversized emphasis within Holocaust historiography towards combating Goldhagen's arguments, this change in the field has also impacted microhistorical accounts. As we saw earlier, any study of individual perpetrator behavior was largely within the psychological subgenre of microhistories. While there are some scholars that continue to do excellent work in the area of anti-Semitism, specifically Johanna Miklik's work on anti-Semitism in Poland, The arguments around Goldhagen unintentionally led to an overemphasis on individual psychology and a lack of emphasis on anti-Semitism as an important causal factor of perpetrator behavior and the Holocaust itself. A second change that occurred around the same time as the Goldhagen-Browning debate and also had an impact on the study of perpetrator anti-Semitism is the problem of universalization of the Holocaust. This universalization and in turn banalization of the Holocaust has been discussed extensively by scholars of Holocaust memory, including in books like Alvin Rosenfeld's End of the Holocaust. Alternately, through being universalized, the Holocaust becomes the story of good versus evil, representing triumph over adversity and any number of other positive outcomes. This is not to say that survivor stories and the resilience of some is not incredibly inspiring or indeed important. Preserving, collecting, and sharing survivor testimony is still vital. However, the drive to make a happy ending and in turn make the witness of the witnesses feel good and not bad about their interaction with the Holocaust can result in neglect of the true horror of what those who did not survive actually experienced. This was anything but redemptive and often resulted in people being stripped of their humanity, tortured and brutally murdered solely because they were Jews. It is unsurprising that anti-Semitism can often disappear from such discourse and be subsumed into a universal notion of hate. This, however, is not only historically inaccurate, but has the effect of de-Judaizing the Holocaust. If anti-Semitism is simply hate, then it's not specifically against Jews. If the Holocaust becomes only a symbol of man's inhumanity to man, then we lose sight of a very important piece of Holocaust understanding, that it was an example of German, Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian neighbors in many cases practicing inhumanity to Jews because they were Jews. This is why newer microhistories that focus on local actions in some of the worst places of murder during the Holocaust might be able to help us reintegrate the importance of anti-Semitism as a factor back into Holocaust studies. Many of these newer works have been possible because of the availability of documentation, testimony, and transcripts that had previously been unavailable before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not only can these help us discover new information about motives of the individual perpetrators responsible for local collaboration and killings, but microhistories like Jan Gross's Neighbors specifically study perpetrator violence outside of institutional structures like state, army, and police. Unlike the subgenre of perpetrator psychology, these allow us to analyze the individual motivation of perpetrators and can help us uncover instances of individual anti-Semitism that was expressed by those who committed violence against and murdered Jews in the worst zones of killing. In addition, studying anti-Semitic views at the individual level is very common in studies of contemporary anti-Semitism, and in those studies gives us an overall societal view through individual attitudes. This bottom-up perspective, instead of the top-down perspective that makes up much of the past study of historical anti-Semitism, can help us to more fully understand how anti-Semitism played a role in the acts of violence by perpetrators. By specifically highlighting and studying anti-Semitism's role as a motivator for individual perpetrators, we can utilize this information in teaching about anti-Semitism today and where the hatred of Jews by individuals, not just states, not just political parties, can lead. By working towards an analytical mode of individual perpetrator anti-Semitism, analytical model of individual perpetrator anti-Semitism, specifically, we can help to reintegrate the study of anti-Semitism as a causal factor in the Holocaust, which is derived from the careful study of new available data and not conjecture that can be readily downplayed or dismissed. What tools might we be able to use to help us mine these microhistories in more depth for more information on the anti-Semitic views of Holocaust perpetrators in Eastern Europe and assist in our creation of a model to measure it? A number of important contributions are contained in the book Geographies of the Holocaust that uses Geographic Information System Technology, or GIS, and visual data to show more clearly how and where mass killings took place. A useful tool can be found in the chapter Killing on the Ground and in the Mind, The Spatialities of Genocide in the East by Bjorn and Knowles, which proposes the use of a locational model of killing that considers regional spaces as well as microspaces of the minds of the killers. While they admit that this is a difficult task, They point to the intersection of location and behavior as a way to, quote, lessen some of this uncertainty and fill some gaps in the testimonial record. They also note that their model can help us to consider the relationship between location and attitude and serve as an analytical model focused on location and behavior. Their model considers the participation of the Wehrmacht soldiers in the mass shootings on the Eastern Front, whether or not they chose to work in varying places associated with genocide. It locates them in those varying places. It considers the behavior of the soldiers based on their choices and their physical proximity to murder as follows: roundup, transportation to killing site, and killing site. In the cases we are looking at, the choices of local perpetrators were not based on choosing whether to work at a roundup site instead of a killing site. Most of them did not function inside of a formal institution, and the killing was often not organized in any meaningful way. Instead, their choices were to actively engage in turning people over who are facing violence or death, or refusing to assist them, essentially complicity, actively participating in that violence, or participating in an act of direct murder. Because we are studying the anti-Semitic attitudes of local perpetrators, we are interested in their behavior and proximity to death that might be based on such attitudes. These attitudes position them within the mental locations or microspaces of the mind that Bjorn and Knowles acknowledge, and bring them closer to direct death with actions potentially driven by such attitudes. With that in mind, we can adapt the Bjorn and Knowles model, maintaining the order of physical proximity to death as follows: complicity, violence, and direct murder. Another tool that we can use to help us look at these microhistories in more depth is a scale that has been created by Daniel Allington and David Hirsch for use in studying contemporary antisemitism and anti-Semitic attitudes in society. It was recently used by the Anti-Defamation League in their latest study on anti-Semitic attitudes in America. This scale is called the Generalized Antisemitism, or GS scale, and incorporates the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as IRA's, working definition of antisemitism. According to a recent article in the Journal of Contemporary Antisemitism, quote, the GS scale is comprised of two 6-item subscales, each containing a balance of reverse-coded items: the Judeophobic, or JPAS scale, which tests for endorsement of classic prejudicial attitudes towards Jews, and the anti-Zionist antisemitism subscale, or the AZAS subscale. Because we are looking at historical and not contemporary antisemitism in this case, we will utilize the Judeophobic, or JPAS subscale portion of the GS scale for the purposes of our study. For ease of understanding, I will hereafter refer to this as the antisemitism scale. Let's look at the antisemitism scale questions and the corresponding one-word summary of anti-Semitic attitudes that each question in the scale is attempting to uncover. As you can see here, the subscale on the Judeophobic questions can be put down to about 6 questions that they have here. Jewish people can be trusted just as much as other nationalities. This is reverse coded, meaning it's a positive versus a negative statement. It has to do with questionnaires and so on, which is not necessarily relevant in this case, but this is the way it's written out. The anti-Semitic attitude that is attempting to be measured is can roughly be summed up as dishonesty. Jewish people are just as loyal to nation as other nationality people. Anti-Semitic attitude, disloyalty. I'm just as open to having Jewish friends as I am to having friends from other sections of nationality society. Anti-Semitic attitude is distrust. Compared to other groups, Jewish people have too much power in the media. Anti-Semitic attitude is power myth. Jewish people talk about the Holocaust to further their political agenda. This is abusive victimhood, anti-Semitic attitude. And Jewish people chase money more than other people do. And this would be the anti-Semitic attitude of the greed myth. Using a scale for contemporary anti-Semitism and applying it to historical anti-Semitism, given that it's meant to be used as a questionnaire instrument, might be considered inappropriate. But we should be able to use the JPAS subscale of the GS scale precisely because it represents classic Judeophobic anti-Semitism that existed before, during, and after the Holocaust. The only question that might be problematic in this regard is the one that contains a reference to the Holocaust itself. And I've translated that to mean the abuse of victimhood, which is a longstanding anti-Semitic trope. Then the maps I will be using here are courtesy of the late, great Martin Gilbert from his Atlas of the Holocaust. Now I'm going to turn to the case studies of microhistory that we might be able to use to explore anti-Semitic attitudes among the perpetrators. It's useful to start with one of the original microhistories, Jan Gross's Neighbors. Unlike some of the newer microhistories that we'll look at shortly, Gross relies almost exclusively on post-war testimony for what occurred in Jedwabne. This includes testimony from perpetrators, which, when it comes to determining individual anti-Semitic attitudes, is problematic. Gross realizes these issues and encourages a critical appraisal of the sources. And with this critical approach in mind, let's attempt to apply the anti-Semitism scale to the testimony of perpetrators and neighbors. Well, Gross himself says that the violence in Jedwabne was, quote, rooted in God knows what motivations. There do appear to be examples of anti-Semitic beliefs that drove the perpetrators. Gross highlights multiple examples from perpetrator trials of the Jews of Jedwabne being made to bring down a statue of Lenin and parade in front of it saying, "The war is because of us, the war is for us." Using the anti-Semitism scale, we could reliably measure these multiple instances of anti-Semitism as falling under the notion of disloyalty. In this case, the nation not receiving loyalty was Poland. The nation not receiving loyalty, that was receiving loyalty from the Jews, was Soviet Russia. Let's look at newer microhistorical studies that can be used to identify individual perpetrators and their anti-Semitic attitudes more specifically. A new study on the perpetrators of the Tuchin pogrom by Jared McBride from the most recent issue of Holocaust and Genocide Studies Journal attempts to uncover names, affiliations, and motives of the perpetrators. His paper provides useful insight into the anti-Semitic attitudes of individual perpetrators that we can utilize in our analysis. McBride specifically notes that Tuchin's, quote, uniquely rich resources could potentially offer information on local level perpetrators. It's one of the many areas of local violence that saw Jews killed as both Jews and as Polish Jews specifically, as we'll see from some of the quotes. A Polish resident of Tuchin recalled how Ukrainian nationalists chanted, quote, "Death, death to Lyaki, death to Muscovite Judeo-Bolshevism." Once again, we can apply the anti-Semitism scale to determine the attitude of disloyalty applies in this case. Jews are seen as not being sufficiently loyal, but instead part of and beholden to Soviet Russia. In a specific charge against militia leader Prokop Polishchuk, survivor Iosif Zaltzman tells of, quote, 30 to 60 people who were forced to admit they were communists before being killed. According to additional testimony from Yusker books, another perpetrator known as Hirstak Delane is claimed to have said death to all Jews, death to Poles, death to Russians, and Stalin, and exclaimed that Stalin himself was a Jew. Using the anti-Semitism scale, this statement could fall under both disloyalty, but also the power myth, given the reference to Stalin's supposed Jewishness. A final example from Tuchin is that of Vashil Humeniuk, who, despite his medical training, refused to assist Jews wounded during the pogrom. According to a witness, Humeniuk's large worldview could be understood in his comment that, quote, Tuchin needs to be cleansed of its Jews, so they will not poison the air anymore. According to the anti-Semitism scale, this statement could fall under the point distrust. It also incorporates old anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews being the carriers of disease. Another useful example of the new microhistories is contained within Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking's Night Without End. This collection of information, newly published in English for the first time, seeks to uncover the microhistories of a number of Polish counties and the treatment of Jews in those counties during the Holocaust. In Jan Grabowski's chapter on Węgrow, there are numerous examples of violence against Jews that were specifically undertaken by the local population. While he notes that there were multicausal factors in the participation of non-Jewish Poles in the rounding up and hunting of Jews, one theme occurs over and over again, and this is directly related to one of the points on the anti-Semitism scale. This is the belief in the greediness and supposed wealth of the Jews, or the greed myth. The hunt for the remaining Jews after the Action of September 23, 1942 in Węgrow. In that hunt, quote, the Blue Police, the local Polish police, the voluntary firefighters, and local volunteers worked together to facilitate the murder of the remainder of the population. Grabowski notes, quote, there is no doubt that the greed and lure of the fabled Jewish gold, essential components of the old toxic anti-Semitic cliches, were among the most powerful motives that moved and animated the local participants. One telling incident is the behavior of a perpetrator, Władysław Krolik, deputy of the Polish Blue Police in a village outside of Węgrow called Gremkov. Krolik hunted Jews who he personally knew, including the Rubin family. Recognizing Mr. Rubin as someone who had made shoes for him, he immediately, quote, grabbed a wad of banknotes from his victim, after which he murdered them in the forest. Grabowski notes, quote, the myth of Jewish gold was so popular and rooted among Christian Poles that it sealed the fate of Rubin, a poor shoemaker from Kałushin, and others hiding with him. Firefighters often work with the Blue Police to round up Jews, and like firefighters in small towns everywhere, and the Polish police themselves, they were, for the most part, regular townspeople. Grabowski quotes eyewitness testimony that notes that firefighters caught groups of Jews, stripped them of any money they might have, and searched them for valuables and cash. Stanislaw Elgas was a firefighter who let Jews stay at his house, but only in return for outrageous amounts of money. According to testimony, quote, once it became clear that the Jews had no more money left, he delivered them into the hands of the gendarme. Here we see a continued emphasis on the greed myth. The attitudes towards Jews as greedy, wealthy, and hoarding were also prevalent in the official communications of the Armia Krajowa, or the AK Home Army, along with regular charges of Jews being communists. Analyzing the data from the microhistories using the anti-Semitism scale, along with the locational model of killing, we can take the first steps in creating a model for the analysis of the anti-Semitism of individual perpetrators in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. Combining these models has the potential to give us useful insight into the causal power of anti-Semitism in the local collaboration and murder of Jewish populations in Eastern Europe, in some of the worst zones of killings of the Shoah. Starting with Gross's observation of perpetrators in Jedwabne and ending with Grabowski's analysis of perpetrators in Węgrow, we look at who the local perpetrator was, with individual name where possible, the physical geographic location, the attitudes expressed, in this case, the type of anti-Semitic bias according to anti-Semitism scale, and the behavior of the perpetrators expressing that attitude according to the locational model of killing. This will create a cross-reference data table that looks something like this. The purpose of the data table and combining of the two models in this way would be to provide a tool that could help quantify correlation between anti-Semitic attitudes, behavior, and physical proximity to the murder by the perpetrators. As noted by Bjorn and Knowles, there remains no comprehensive map or database of Einsatzgruppen killings, but, quote, information of it quite detailed exists in archives, regional studies, and survivor testimonies. But these sources have yet to be compiled or examined in any deliberate and comprehensive manner. While they're referring particularly to Einsatzgruppen actions here, the same can be said of local pogroms and massacres carried out in Eastern Europe. A number of times, these actions intersected with one another. The closest thing we have is the Goldhagen mapping project of the killing of Eastern European Jews in what's known as the Holocaust by bullets, created by Father Patrick Dubois. This provides detailed testimony and photographs, and is utilized, for example, here in New York in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in their Holocaust exhibit. However, as you can see from the map where the blue indicates a site of killing that has not yet been populated with data, there's a great deal left to be discovered, much of it in the areas that we specifically looked at today, and that are covered by the new microhistories. This map is an example of the type of visual work we might begin to do with such a model. Here we see the examples of the 3 case studies that we looked at, with colored lines representing the types of anti-Semitic attitudes that we determined from the data in the microhistories. If you could imagine a map as full as the previous one, populated with this data on perpetrator anti-Semitism, that can give you some idea of where we might be able to go with such a model in the future, to help us visualize the frequency and location of certain anti-Semitic attitudes among local perpetrators. In addition, we could add a heat map based on the locational model of killing, in which heat corresponds to proximity to death, with dark red representing direct murder and colors at the cooler end of the spectrum representing violence and complicity, respectively. This would provide a visual representation of the table used above that allows us to see the cross-section between both behavior and attitudes within a spatial dimension. This is only a sample of what a heat map visualization might look like. The ideas I've discussed today for a model for the study of anti-Semitic attitudes among perpetrators of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe come with their fair share of challenges. Any model of this type will be required to meet the rigorous testing required to ensure that it was useful and accurate as possible. As acknowledged by Bjorn and Knowles in their study, all models are only as good as the data entered into them. However, they note, although such incompleteness and inconsistency would limit the utility of the data for answering some questions as precisely as one might wish, there are established methods for dealing with these problems, and that the data need not be perfect to support worthwhile and quite powerful visualizations. This remains true in the study of anti-Semitic attitudes of local perpetrators in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. Yet there is clearly a lot of new information out there that might be useful in helping us to better understand it and enhance the study of anti-Semitism within Holocaust studies as a whole. Other challenges included the ongoing impact of the Goldhagen discussion on the field of Holocaust studies, as well as the continuing universalization and de-Judaization of the Holocaust, and its impact on studying anti-Semitism as a causal factor. In addition, state actors have weighed in on these topics, as evident by the attempt of the right-wing nationalist Polish government, for example, to challenge historians, fearing it will bring the state and the Polish people into disrepute, regardless of the truth of the information. Here I have a picture of two of the historians involved in one of these disputes, Jan Grabowski, Barbara Engelking, holding the Polish versions of Night Without End, one of the books that we just looked at. This also remains an ongoing issue in post-Soviet states that maintained a victim myth post-World War II for the nation and downplayed the Jewish-specific character of the Holocaust. This has resulted in Holocaust revisionism in the service of various nation states, and perhaps we can get more into that in the discussion. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have or hear any comments you might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was really great, really interesting, very well informed and very thoughtful exposition.
Thank you.
So I think we're all very grateful to you. I think there will probably be quite a lot of questions. I've got some, but I'll hold them for the moment and let other people come in. So I'm opening it up now for discussion. So if people could give me some indication by raising their hands on the chat, that would be great, as to who would like to ask questions. Thank you.
I think David Seymour has put his hand up.
Thanks very much. Okay, David, you need to unmute. You haven't unmuted yet.
Hello.
Well done.
Sorry, COVID nostalgia. Tami, good to see you. Thank you. That was incredible. That was, sorry, I'm gushing because I've made loads of notes. That was a really interesting paper on so many different levels. I've got a couple of comments and then a question. I particularly like it because it brings back, you touched on these in your discussion, it brings in the notion of responsibility. Ever since the 80s with, you know, the intentionalists and the functionalists, and then you got the Bauman, the rational, even Adorno, where it was no one's fault really. You know, it was structural, and there was no animosity. You know, we were only doing, part of a cog. The other thing is, of course, you mentioned this again, the Holocaust by bullets. And it's interesting, there's now a focus back to the grubbiness of mass murder, the eye to eye, which this really brings out. I've got loads of notes here. The other thing I liked also, you talked about Holocaust memorialization, is that it was always someone else, it wasn't us. And it's become universal. It's the Jewish aspects, anti-Semitism, have been abstracted out. And what we've seen, I can only talk about England, is that abstraction, as soon as anti-Semitism is mentioned, it's seen as dishonorable. It's seen as a clever ploy. it feeds into anti-Semitic discourse. And I find that really interesting. Now, the question I have, I've just finished reading, I think it's called In the Midst of Civilized Europe, where as far as I understand, his thesis is that actually in the part of the world that you were just describing, the Nazis didn't need to do much. There was a whole tradition of pogroms against Jews anyway that the Nazis could tap into. So I guess the question I'm asking, and sorry if this is a bit garbled because I've just heard what you've had to say and I'm trying to listen to it all. I guess the question I'm asking is, we know that anti-Semitism and of a murderous kind, if not a genocidal kind, then of a murderous kind, existed in what Schneider calls the bloodlands. We know that. I'm wondering whether it would be interesting to see that in a region in which the Holocaust happened, but did not have such an overt pre-existing history. I'm thinking of Italy. I'm thinking of France. I know they weren't killing fields, but there were, no doubt there were assaults, there was violence. I'm also thinking of the Channel Islands, where they were only too quickly to hand over Jews. And countries like Britain, like America, feel morally safe because, as I think Martin Jack said years ago, they didn't have the chance to collaborate. So I was wondering whether your work could also be used in places where that prehistory might be more subtle than an overt history of pre-existing anti-Semitic pogroms and violence. So I hope that made sense, but I really, that paper just opened up a whole raft of ideas. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, just to respond to that, I mean, I think it's an important question. I mean, obviously there are geographical differences. There's history of anti-Semitism in Poland. Like I said, Johanna Miklik has a lot of good work on that. I think, you know, looking at a comparative sense of places like Italy, France, compared to somewhere like Poland and so places on the Western Front versus the Eastern Front, I think there was an element of racialization of the quote unquote Slavs that played into a lot of the violence of not necessarily you know, Polish people against Polish Jews, for example, but things like the Ukrainian, as we saw the quotes from the Ukrainian nationalists coming in, which was part of, again, longstanding issues between nations and national rivalries. So there obviously is a huge amount of you know, geographical difference there. I think you know, you say the moral safety of the United States, and it's interesting because recently also the United States is kind of doing a little bit of a reckoning with Holocaust for what I think is probably the first time. Much of the United States, you know, narrative around the Holocaust is that we went in, we were the good guys, we rescued, everybody could come here as immigrants and, you know, land of the free, but that's not what actually happened. And some of the museums are taking a more a better approach on this, where they're being very brutally honest about the fact that the United States actually had very harsh immigration policies, did not allow people in. The new documentary recently by Ken Burns is very good on explaining how it was an immigration issue. And so Americans can't really say that so much anymore, that they were morally absolved, because, you know, even they had the Avian conference and, you know, nothing happened. Essentially, nobody wanted to take European Jewish refugees. So yeah, I think that's important. And just one quick note on Bloodlands. I think Snyder's work is really important in that, you know, as part of the spatial turn, I like his idea, the fact that he kind of plays more to a Eastern European audience in some ways by sort of tying that narrative into the, you know, between between Hitler and Stalin, you know, we were victims of both communism and fascism and so on. But I think one of the things that always made me a little bit unsure about his position of the bloodlands was it was almost a kind of, I don't know, like maybe metaphysical is the word, like, you know, thing about the land itself is violent, and there's some kind of thing going on there that just happens to mean that it's violent all the time. And that again goes back to the question of responsibility that you're talking about, where it's like it's either structural or it's the land or it's just that part of the world they just can't, you know, which we wouldn't accept those as definition, you know, we wouldn't accept those as reasoning for the Rwandan genocide. We would say that's not a very good, you know, reason to explain. Just say, oh, well, Africa's violent or whatever, you know, that's not correct, but we tend to sometimes do it with Eastern Europe. So anyway.
Thanks very much, Tami. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tami. I think Andrew's next. Is that right, Joe? Andrew? Would you like to, could we see you and could you unmute?
Yes, hello.
Great,
sorry, let
you.
me just take the hand down. I'm struggling even more with technology than David Seymour. There you have it.
Feel better, David?
But just so you know, I am watching the game where Hirsch is as well. Just a couple of things. First of all, on Snyder, I think the problem with his work is he tends to provide a political explanation for anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish behavior. Whether or not it's anti-Semitic is another matter. And I think one of the best critiques of his work, I would suggest looking at Gil Rubin's article in Tablet, where he takes apart Snyder's notion that Pidzulski was somehow some kind of, you know, Zionist. It's a very interesting work. I'm very skeptical of Snyder's work, I have to say. I know he's done a bit of Zelensky washing recently, but I'm skeptical. The second issue is simply this. I think this is very interesting, but there's a problem with as you said, the evidence that goes into the model. And as Grabowski and Engelking say in the introduction to the English translation, you know, in microhistory where there's no evidence, you just have to be silent. Now, that's not what a lot of historians do. Obviously, there are examples where people say, I mean, there are testimonies of people saying that they're looking for Jewish gold and all this kind of thing. And that, by the way, is a common thing. But I think there's a problem with that because the quality of evidence is often weak. And I think one of the strengths of Grabowski's book and of the Microhistories is that they're very honest about where the evidence is weak. Another just quick point is that anti-Semitism is a funny phenomenon because it has certain common aspects, but it's also different by location. I'll give you an example. The notion that wherever the Jews were, there was gold is something you find in Greece, right? People were digging up the Jewish cemetery in Greece, partly to destroy it because they took advantage of the German presence there, but also because they believed there was gold there. They ripped apart the incredibly badly made houses in which Jews had been living for 20 years since the fire of 1917 in Salonika, believing that there was gold hidden in the walls. So there's that common aspect. But, you know, anti-Semitism in Greece is also a form of ethnic and territorial antagonism, which does not apply, for example, in France. So I think that there's that aspect too. When we use the term anti-Semitism with regard to the Holocaust, we may need to start breaking it down into different subcategories. And then just on Seymour's point about the liberal democracies and the Holocaust, I think what's fascinating, of course, is that the Netherlands had such an appalling record, and yet it was far more democratic and liberal than Belgium or France. And yet the Jewish death rate there was just shockingly high. But thank you very much for an interesting talk.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, that's really important points. I think that the question of evidence is always going to be, you know, something that historians have to, you know, look at. And I think with using the microhistory and, you know, them saying you just have to be silent, that's true. But I think one of the good things that we have now with some of the visualizations is that we can take the small instances in congregate and build them into a visualization that might help us understand something bigger. Maybe it won't, but I think it's worth trying because I think we might be able to find out, see some patterns and see some things that might be very interesting for us. Interestingly, that you said that about the Holocaust in Greece. I recently did a course on the Catholic Church and the Holocaust, and one of the modules was actually on the Greek Orthodox Church and the different kind of attitude that they took towards Jews in Greece compared to like the Catholic Church, and how they were very much focused on Jews being citizens. Which was not necessarily the case in some of the more in some of the other places. So that's an interesting point there. But I do think there's a tension between, like I said, there's these tensions between nationalities that kind of exist outside of the so-called Jewish question and have an impact on the types of anti-Semitism that we see in particular areas, in particular geographical areas.
Thank you. Right, I might pitch in myself then for a second while other people gather their thoughts. So that was a really great talk, and I think in particular your use of what David Hirsch and Daniel Allington have done is very, very interesting. But I want to suggest a couple of things to you. You may disagree with this. The first is that you're going to have to, at some point, link up the bottom-up and the top-down explanation. I don't think you can avoid thinking about the top-down question, right? And I don't think you can avoid thinking about the structures within which even non-state and local actors operate. So I think that's another challenge for you. Right. So I want to offer a couple of thoughts about that. And the first is that I've talked about this for a long time. I've taught courses on Goldhagen and Browning. And I've always been struck, and intentionalism and functionalism for a long time. I've always been struck by I think it's the reasonably obvious absurdity of not placing anti-Semitism at the center of it. It's so implausible to think that large numbers of Jews were being killed and the people who killed them were not in any way touched by anti-Semitism or not fundamentally motivated by anti-Semitism. It's so implausible. You'd think in any other case, people would say this is ridiculous. And I think I would want to defend Goldhagen a bit here. I don't think he is quite the barrier that you think he is. And I think a work that needs to be written, there are bits and pieces around the place, looking at the reaction to Goldhagen among professional historians and their, I would say, obsessional desire to downgrade anti-Semitism. They're recoiling from what he says about anti-Semitism. But the arguments are actually very flawed when you look at them closely. So let me take Browning, because most people think Browning completely came out on top in the debate with Goldhagen. Actually, Browning, in the end, as you correctly pointed out, says, look, my research confirms what Milgram and Zimbardo said. But Browning and most historians seem to know absolutely nothing about social psychology. They take what Milgram says as given. He must be right. He's a social psychologist. It's as if a social psychologist looked at a historian, selected the historian that they wanted to use, and said, see, the historians think X. Actually, within the field of social psychology, lots of social psychologists think that what Milgram said isn't right. And it can't be used like this. There are lots of obvious problems with the research in its own right, but particularly if you want to transplant it to the Holocaust. Let me give you one obvious example. Like the Milgram experiments, right, which were conducted by people in white coats, right, acknowledged experts, were supposedly for the good of the people upon whom the electric shocks were being visited. Right? Nobody in their right mind would say that when the Jews were being killed, this was for the good of Jews. It's just, it's so obviously stupid that it's mind-boggling that anybody would think this is relevant. It's exactly the opposite of the case. I just want to offer that to you, all right? The second thing about Browning and Goldhagen, that the after the testimony that people want to use after the war, and this does apply to your microhistory project, right, has to be thought about. What is it that people are saying to what audience? Right? Nobody after the war is going to say, yes, I did it because I hated Jews. What they all said was, well, you know, it was very difficult. We were in a very unfamiliar situation. We were following orders. There was peer group. And nobody's going to say, yes, I'm an anti-Semite and that's why I did it. But even Browning recognizes, right, that that's what was going on. Right? So it's just not the case that anti-Semitism is the secondary or tertiary or non-factor that the functionalists and admirers of Browning say. Right? So I would want to say that you need to look at some of the critiques of Milgram at the reception of Goldhagen and what it is that people don't want to think about. And that brings me to the third point I want to make, which is you talk about universalization and de-Judaization. And I think that's a very big factor. That, of course, is why David Hirsch and Daniel Langton did their work. That's what IRA is about. So you can't avoid the political context of the drive to downplay anti-Semitism now, and that it's not absent from academic debates. And there is something very profound about it. People do not want to think about anti-Semitism for reasons that don't have to do with the evidence, but have to do with other factors. So I think that would help your research, and it would then help you deal with the obvious problem that you're going to have, which is that the microhistories can take you so far. It's not just whether the evidence is strong enough, but that you can't in the end explain enough through microhistories. The microhistories have to be related to the macro history. And just one final thought about Snyder and why he's problematic. Snyder's big thing, and lots of people's big thing, right, is all the killing took place in a particular location zone, right? But actually people were not just being killed there. They were brought to be killed there from other places. So what was going on when people were being brought to be killed to the killing zone? You can't use a locational explanation to explain why people were brought from one place to that location. Okay, so those are things. So I think you can use all of that, I think, to buttress your argument. But I think the evidence you provide is terrific, and the use you make, I just want you to kind of locate it also in a broader context. Well, I suggest you do.
Thanks very much, Philip. I mean, those are all excellent points. I completely agree. I think that definitely is the challenge, to bring the microhistory back to the macro, to tie it into the social structures. I think that the challenge is to not go too far in the microhistory direction, you know, as they've done before, you know, in a correction to the Goldhagen debate. And I think the question of, you know, it definitely has to do with the study. I think the universalization of the Holocaust, that's like a, you know, its own discussion, but I think it does have an impact on the field. And I think that right now, you have the Holocaust gets subsumed into genocide studies and human rights. A lot of the Holocaust studies programs are now, and genocide and human rights. It's fine. The Holocaust was a genocide. It is a genocide. It was a genocide. And in fact, I think it's unique in the field in that it launched the field. You know, this is the event or events that launched the field. So it kind of gets universalized, but then also it gets subsumed instead of remaining its own thing to be studied. And it's kind of strange how that has happened, but I think that there does have to be a push to try to bring that back as its own field of study and not just subsume it into like genocide, because genocide, really important to study. The Holocaust was a genocide, but it deserves to be studied in its own right. And I think when you study it in its own right, it's very clear that it is specifically the extermination of the Jews. Obviously, other groups were also targeted peripherally. But it's like you said, it is absurd to sort of think about it. It almost seems like a truism, like who would say that the Holocaust didn't have to do with anti-Semitism? But if you look at what people are saying, you know, it's becoming less and less about that and more about, I mean, some of that has to do with Arendt's, you know, original arguments about, you know, just following orders and, you know, desktop killers or bureaucrat, you know, this kind of thing, when it comes to responsibility. And that's kind of always been one strain. But I do think that there's definitely much to be done. And what you say about social psychology definitely is that's a really good point. You know, they sort of just use those arguments because they're known. I think most people know the Milgram experiments and the Zimbardo experiments, and just say, well, yeah, it's because of that. And the interesting thing is that the psychological arguments are actually, you know, to an extent they're social, they're within structures, but they are based on kind of like individual psychology a little bit. But then it's like, but then ideology doesn't fit into that anywhere. Like anti-Semitism doesn't kind of make sense. You know, it's kind of like a missing piece. So, yeah, but very, very interesting.
Okay. Do we have anybody else who'd like to? Okay. If not, I think I'd like to. Oh, Andrew, you'd like to come back, please? Yeah. Please.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to make a suggestion. There's a very interesting historian of the genocide of the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians called Fatma Mucce-Göçek, and what she's done is she's looked at memoirs. Now, memoirs are inherently problematic, but she's looked at memoirs of Ottoman and Turkish Republic perpetrators. It's a huge book, but I would suggest having a look at that because gives you a very interesting comparative. And I think I remember one of the cases she had was a guy who, in his old age, when the whole issue of the, you know, forced marches of the Armenians into the Syrian desert was raised, kind of got himself out of his armchair and sort of shouted, "I would do it again." So in a context in which there is impunity for genocide, in which there's been no justice and no proper history, it's interesting to see that the evidence is really there. But I think her work's really interesting and might be worth a look. And then just on what the chairman said about the you know, post-war stuff, absolutely right. And I think that's one of the weaknesses. If you look at the work done on micro studies of civil wars by Kalivas and others, you know, you talk to some old bloke 50 years after the event and the evidence is totally unreliable. But I think look at Fatma's work, it's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And just one other point I was thinking about was the question of Germany post World War II. I think this obviously had an impact on perpetrator testimony, the way that they were tried, because as Philip said, you know, people aren't going to say, "Oh yeah, I did it because I don't like Jews," because at that particular time there was an entire, you know, movement to sort of re-educate Germans, and that was the last thing you wanted to admit, is that you hadn't got over your dislike of Jews. And so that very rarely shows up, like you said, Browning notes that himself, you know, that very rarely shows up in testimony. But part of that was the drive by the West to create West Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and the start of the Cold War. So there's a whole like geopolitical thing going on there when it comes right down to that individual perpetrator testimony. So yeah, very, very interesting.
Okay, well, thanks. I just want to make one additional point about other genocides. I think actually you could look at the Rwandan genocide too, because there's a similar desire to try and downplay anti-Hutu racism there, actually. But if you read Jean Hatzfeld's interviews with perpetrators, right, the same thing is just glaringly clear, right, that they hated Tutsi, right? And that's a major motivation. And so there's something going on where people don't want to think about this. That's really what I want to suggest to you. There's something very odd going on when people think that the people who were killed were not hated by the people killing them. It's so implausible. I mean, I used to tease my students to say only an academic would come up with the idea. That wasn't motivated. Anyway.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting too, because we see in academia, we see specific studies of, you know, systemic racism, especially in the United States. You know, you see focus on issues of systemic racism, not just, you know, in the system, but attitudes, racist attitudes of you know, people who had white supremacists or have white supremacist beliefs and so on. So that's kind of had a recent, you know, uptick in academia. But then on the flip side of it, like you're saying, we have these sort of like genocides where it's not really, it's kind of downplayed and made tertiary, you know, to the actual racism or hatred that's going on there. Very interesting.
Okay, I think we'll call it a day there, or an evening, I should say.
I think Steve has his hand up.
Sorry, Joe, please. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, somebody else has their hand up. Oh, great. Sorry, Steve, please do. Yeah. You need to unmute. Great.
Hi. I wondered if you noticed a difference in the treatment of these issues between the right and the left in politics, because, you know, I certainly do recognise some of the tropes and interpretations, put it nicely, of history that have come from people on the Labour left or its periphery. But I wondered, but also, you know, some of those things I hear more from the right. So I wonder if you observed anything different in those attitudes.
With regards to the microhistories, or
the understanding of what happened in the Holocaust. Because you know, or their accounts of what happened and what caused it. You know.
You know, I'm not certain. I think that it's a general. I just think it's a general change in the field. I don't know. I actually don't know the politics of Goldhagen and Browning. You know, maybe Philip does, but I think you know, I think the field itself, as along with academia, you know, has moved to the left, and you know, we see that in a variety of different topics, and with that. Certain things are prioritized over other things, but I think part of the universalization that happened was not necessarily out of a left-wing drive, but it was done because people were trying to make the Holocaust relatable so that people would be interested in it, and so it was kind of an unintended consequence that it's become universalized to the point where it becomes a symbol instead of, you know, what it actually was, and which was really terrible and horrific. I mean, and of course people say, again, that's a given, but you know, some of the ways that people learn about the Holocaust is very you know, with kid gloves and not very realistic. You know, obviously there's age appropriate stuff for, you know, kids, like in Holocaust education in the United States. I don't mean that, but I just mean in general. Actually, in Alvin Rosenfeld's book End of the Holocaust, he has a great section on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and how that universalization happens. And it also happens as part of an Americanization as well, where, you know, they want people to feel good when they've considered this. And so making it universalized has, in effect, I think, downplayed anti-Semitism to a certain extent, which it doesn't really necessarily fit into the left or right, you know, in that way. It's just kind of it come about as a matter of course in those things. I don't think that there's a right versus left in academia, because, you know, it's pretty much just left in academia, to be honest. Even like, but when it comes to, you know, Holocaust studies, I think there is, and I think some of the people at the recent conference, the London conference that we had last year, you know, have been doing some work on that in the field of genocide studies, in particular, some of the issues that have come up about this kind of universalization and that type of thing. And I'm not sure, they might have something on whether it's, you know, can be put into those kind of like left-right categories.
Let's say something. I think one of the tendencies of the universalization, though, is sometimes to maneuver to lessen the distinctiveness of the Holocaust in order, in some cases, to actually present Israel as committing a Holocaust. You know, that's some of the dialogue we hear on the left, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism and, you know, the studies around that are certainly very interesting, and they are tied. But, you know, the Holocaust is tied to memory in Israel as much as it's tied to memory in Poland, as much as, you know, these places. The memory of the Holocaust means different things politically in different countries. Obviously, you know, with the I'm not sure, you know, it's a good question, because I'm not sure that people intentionally say, oh, well, the Holocaust is not important because Israel's bad or something like that. But I do think that's part of the de-Judaization is possibly tied to anti-Zionist attitudes, but that's something that I think probably could use a lot more study.
All right, I'm glancing now at Joe because I nearly closed this down too quickly. Do you think, is anybody else would like to come back in, or should we come to a close? Okay, I'm taking silence there. So I'd like to just end by thanking Tami very much for a really interesting, very thought-provoking, extremely well-informed and grounded talk. I think the world is going to do a lot with your PhD. I wish you all the success with it, but I think the road you're going down is really an insufficiently traveled one, I would say. So I think there's a lot of work, a lot of information, a lot of thought, a lot of conclusions that will come as will be very helpful to many people. So I wish you all the best with it. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Centre for giving us a taste of the kind of work that you've been doing. So thanks a lot. I'm sure everybody else would want to thank you too. And thank you all also for coming tonight. And we'll see you again shortly, I hope. Joe, have I covered everything in David's absence?
Just mentioning that, thanks, Philip, all the important things. Just mentioning that if you want to make a donation, because we don't charge for the seminars, I put the link in the chat. And also do have a look on our YouTube channel, which I've also put in the chat, if you want to watch this again or any of our other seminars in the series. And thank you so much, Tami.
And thank you, Joe, for helping with this tonight. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care. Keep well.